A scene for y'all this morning. Say you are at the grocery store or wherever you like to go to buy some produce. And you might meet an interesting person or maybe a wonderful couple, and they see you from off in the distance, and you're coming down the same aisle, and you're doing that little weird thing where you're like, am I going to talk to them or they're going to talk to me? I don't know. I just want to handle my business kind of thing. But they see your shirt, and they notice that they have a similar interest as you. So they might approach you and they say something along the lines of, hey, I like your shirt. And you look down, oh, this thing, what you know about this? And they might say, I love that artist, or I love that author. That's my favorite book. They might say, that's my favorite team. That we go way back, like 4 flats on a Cadillac. Somebody finished it in their head. Then you strike up this conversation and you realize that y'all have similar personality, maybe, you're bonding over similar interests. And you go, man, that was an interesting exchange. They offer their hand to you, you shake it, you get names, you exchange goodbyes, and you start heading down the aisle, going on about your business, just before you are stopped by them and invited to come hang out later. They say something along the lines of, a few friends of mine that I'm sure you probably like because we hit it off really well, that we're going to get together for dinner tomorrow night, and we're going to play a few games. Maybe you can call it game night or something like that, right? And you might, hesitate because you just met the person, or, if you're extroverted, you might, I love meeting people. Let me go in there, and I'm going to have a blessed time. So you could be uncertain, you could be excited, but either way, you say yes. And then you pull up to the place, they send you the address, you get there the very next day, and you got, your dinner clothes on, you're going to make a good first impression in front of the other friends, the other similar interest folks. But you drive up to the house, and you notice there's no cars there. You look at your clock, realize you're fashionably late as usual, and you see no cars, but a whole bunch of bikes in the front yard. It's like, that's interesting. But you're not going to let it stop you. You get out of the car, you go up to the front door, and you knock on the door, and you realize that the person that answers the door is not the person that you met at the grocery store. In fact, it's an elderly lady who's wearing an apron, but the smell of food doesn't even fill the air. So this is really starting to confuse you. But you throw it aside, and this lady looks at you. You can give her an awkward hello. She gives you one back. And she's like, are you here for the play date? And you like, play date? I'm here for dinner and game night with the lady that I met at the grocery store. Oh, okay. Everybody's all upstairs. They're still playing with the Barbie doll house. They're playing with the G.I. Joes. Everybody's having a phenomenal time with the Beyblades and the tech decks and all the action figures that I just bought. And y'all looking at me crazy. Like you should be looking at the lady who's saying that these grown adult people that you're expecting to hang out with is upstairs playing with childhood toys. But you sticking around or you leaving? What you doing? I might leave. But say you do step in the house. And she's like, dinner will be ready in a few. I just got to put the warm milk and get the bottles. I got to grab them from out of the microwave, and everybody's going to come down, and we're going to have ourselves a good little dinner. If you were here earlier, you might have got the Dino Nuggets or some Pop-Tarts, but, kids love to eat. You staying still or you leaving? Something's wrong, right? Something is wrong, family. There's an expectation that these maturing adults or these grown people should be living grown lives. You either pulled up to How to Catch a Predator party or you pulled up to a place where grown people are not growing up, and that's a problem. If this shocks or stuns you in the way in which it should, then you can identify with how Paul feels about him writing to the Corinthians as he's learning about this church that he had planted about a year and a half before he's writing this letter, you're hearing him refer to them as children, infants. Based on the report that he's getting about their behavior, something is wrong. Paul expected Christian maturity. He expected them to not be behaving in the way that they were. This was unbecoming of what it meant to be a Christian, because to be a believer, to be a Christian, means that the Spirit of God dwells inside of you, so he should be maturing you along if you are yielding to him the way in which you should be. And don't get me wrong, like a year and a half, you might look at that like, that's not a lot of time. But think about Paul as his expectation is that he's seeing the Spirit of God help these people discern the difference between what is right and what is wrong. Pastor Davis preached some awesome sermons so far about what it looked like in Corinth. The kind of behavior that was happening in Corinth that would just be wild to us to imagine right now. He talked about earlier about having godly wisdom and how that comes from the Spirit of God. And these Corinthians possess that, but are not living it out. Something's wrong. And so in this particular chapter, today, Paul will help us examine these two types of people that he's seeing here in chapter 3. You got immature believers. You got immature builders. These are people that he's referring to in verse 1 as not yet being spiritual people. Now, and by spiritual, we're not talking about, you connected, with the crystals and the ancestors and, you connected with your people. I'm not talking about that. By spiritual, what he's referring to is being full of, led by, and in touch with what concerns the Spirit of God. That's what he's referring to as being spiritual. And he's saying these believers are not yet walking that out. So let's look at it again. In Paul's words, he says, "But brothers, I could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it, and even now you are not ready." They're still not ready. "For you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and only behaving in a human way? One says, I follow Paul. One says, I follow Apollos. Are you not behaving merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants, through whom you believed, as the Lord has assigned to each. See, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth." And then he ties them together by saying, "He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive a reward for the wages according to his labor. For you are fellow workers you are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." Let's talk for a second about the immature believer that Paul is referring to. Like I said, Paul spent a year and a half with them. And that's not a lot of time. But that amount of time should teach us something that's true about spiritual maturity. See, oftentimes we think spiritual maturity is about age and longevity and how long you have proclaimed Christ in your life. We think spiritual maturity is about how long you've been going to church or how many times you've come to Bible study. We think spiritual maturity is on a timeline. But at least how Paul is addressing him, we can see that spiritual maturity is not about age. It's about discernment and participation in the work of the Spirit in us and in the world. Some quick supporting verses to highlight this truth, as we see in Hebrews, as the writer is addressing people that have been with God for a while and should know the things of God. But listen to how the writer of Hebrews addresses them. He says, for though this time you ought to be teachers. So this time you should be here. You should be further along. But yet you need someone to teach you, again, the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk. That timeline thing ain't working out for you because there's not a progression of spiritual growth. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. But solid food, now listen to how he describes a mature person. But solid food is for the mature. And who's the mature? For those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. And who's helping you do that? The Spirit of truth, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit that dwells within us, that lives within us. Another way in which we see this in Scripture is Paul talking to Timothy, a young pastor that he's planting, and that's going to lead a church of folks that are probably twice his age, right? And a lot of folks that are new to faith, a lot of folks that have been that converted to that came from Judaism into Christianity as Messianic Jews. We got a lot of folks that Timothy is about to pour into that might seem of a different stature and class and age than Timothy, but Paul says to him, let no one despise you for your youth. There's that time thing. But set the believers an example in speech and in conduct and in love, faith, and in purity. Discernment and participation with the Spirit, that is where spiritual maturity lies. See, Christians, we can mature in dog years or we can mature backwards. And I know that might sound a little funny, but if you've been around a few Benjamin Button believers, you would know what I mean when I say Christians can mature backwards. We can be walking with the Lord for a long time, and then all of a sudden, grief gets a hold of us, and we stop participating with the Spirit. We stop listening to where the Spirit of God is leading us and directing us, and He might call us to love our neighbor, and we might say no. He might say you ought to go to them and make it right with them. You ought to forgive them. You ought to experience unity with them. And we might say, but I don't like that person. We are maturing backwards when we are not participating with the Spirit. Grief can do that to us. Disappointment can do that to us. Cynicism can do that to us. Bitterness can do that to us. We have these real emotions as a part of our human experience. God created us that way on purpose. But oftentimes, because they are tainted by sin, we allow them to inform us instead of allowing the Spirit of God to inform us on how we ought to live our life. See, if they had been yielding to the Spirit, it would have been evident in their actions that they were proficient in discerning right from wrong, good from evil. Maybe they wouldn't even have needed to send to Paul to have him address some of the issues going on in the church, because they would have been spiritually mature enough to know that you should not be laying with your mother-in-law. You should not be dividing over leaders. You should not be living promiscuous lives. These are things that were going on in the church at Corron. What are these actions here that Paul's calling childish? Jealousy, strife, division over leaders. Just at least in this small portion of the text that we're going through this morning, those are three that we find. Jealousy, strife, and division over leaders. They're divided by jealousy. They're trying to attach themselves to leaders. This was something that was common for the non-believers in Corinth, the Gentile believers, to do. They would try to latch on to someone that they called wise and they would follow these wise people, and they would gain some form of status or stature amongst people. In a sense, if I could attach myself to a guy that everybody else deems is better than everybody else, more wiser than everybody else, then now I look good. You see what I'm saying? So they start just trying to push people forward, just trying to distinguish the difference between people, but we've never been good at that. We have never been good at valuing the things that God values. We got to stop these ascension ladders, this leadership thing to where I'm here now. I've been here for 15 years walking with Jesus, and I'm gonna talk to you as if you were a subordinate to me. We got to stop these ideas that we think that just because, fill in the blank, whatever reason you might fill in the blank there, just because this, I am now better than you, and I deserve more clout. We got to stop that. That's not the example that Paul is setting for the church in Corinth. You can see how verse 5 through 8, how he addresses those people who were trying to put him and Apollos on different pedestals. I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. Paul's like, what then is Apollos? What then is Paul? Who am I? What do you mean? You know? But servants through whom you believe, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos water, but only God gave growth. Neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants, Paul. He who waters, Apollos. We won. So why try to divide? That's immature, brothers and sisters. That is Christian immaturity. And we've never been good at choosing idols. We've never been good at it. As one commentator said, J. Paul Sample, he said, those who think themselves as spiritual persons, but who contribute to divisions in the community are immature and have an incorrect self-assessment. This subordination thinking is immature. Perhaps maybe we ought to exchange that for if God assigns it, then maybe we trust that it is God divine, and we see how it works together to the glory and honor of his name, to the glory of his kingdom, to the building up of his church. While divisions and jealousy might be immature, mutual ownership and partnership are mature. See, what what immature believers want to do is idolize leaders, cause division, be jealous of one another, and be self-seeking. So in light of that, we should recognize that personal immaturity stunts church growth. What I do affects this body. What you do affects this body, not just in these four walls, but in that community. You like, I don't know about that, Corron. Well, I'll submit to you an example that Paul gave about us. He says, you are a body, and Christ is the head. And as a man who's recovering from surgery, I can tell you very much so that I've learned a very real lesson of how one part of the body, I'm not going to point to it, I almost did, so I'm going to scratch my back. How one part of the body can affect the other parts of the body greatly. For example, my legs were fine, and they just wanted to get up and just go flying up around just like I always do. But as soon as I did that, I started hurting in other places. And now my whole body has to respond to that. I either got to go lay my tail down or do what the doctor said. I'm not going to tell y'all what the doctor said. All right? We are all connected to one another. How we act impacts the body. We also need to recognize that we are partners with one another, which means that we should be, in a sense, looking for ways in which we can use we language, not they language. For example, oh, up there at the church, they are doing. No, it's we. Well, the leadership team, they are. No, we. The children's tree, we. It's all of us. Every single one of us in this room has a part to play, ladies and gentlemen. So we need to recognize our ownership of the ministry within the community of believers. For example, if there are certain people in the room today that might see a need, a ministry need that we may have, my encouragement to you is, if it aligns with our core values, don't wait around, chase it down. Don't just wait around for, I'm going to wait for them to get the idea and do this, and no. You chase it down. God has given you that vision. God has given you the understanding of a need, a hole in which you might be gifted enough to step into. Not just here as well, but in the entire Christian community. For example, you might be a single person in the house, you know. A lot of times you start talking about singles, people get nervous. I'm not going to do y'all like that. But the reality is, as a single person, I remember often wondering, why does it feel like the church is always catered to those who are married or with children? They always talk about those things. They don't really talk about things that pertain to me and my world and what's going on and how I can. And in a way, it almost feels like there was pedestals placed on marriage and no real attention to singleness. But there's a need here. And singles, what if it is that God is trying to get you to help lead, shepherd, steward, love, care for, encourage one another? I would love to see a group of West Side singles growing together, loving each other, praying for each other, keeping each other accountable, stirring one another on in the faith, reminding each other that y'all are not less than. We are not less than. Some of us in the room are dads. And sometimes we get pigeonholed to, work, busy, come back, hang out with the kids, and don't get to interact with other brothers. There's a real need there for men to connect. Now, women, y'all do this great. Y'all always talking to each other. Y'all follow each other to the bathroom. I ain't figured that part out yet. But we don't do that. What would it look like to get a bunch of dads together, dads on duty, or whatever you want to call it, on mission to love one another, care for each other, encourage one another? A lot of people work remote these days, isolated from community for the majority of the day. What would it look like to get remote workers meeting weekly? I don't know. But if that's on your heart, then maybe God can use you to chase that down. Don't wait around. Seed, water, planter, all of this language that Paul is using emphasizes that there is an expectation of action and growth. Action and growth. And anybody who's planted or been in the community garden, you know that you can't plant anything in a field if you don't put the work in. You can't just stick a seed in the ground and walk away. You got to consistently put the work and the effort in. And culturally, I think, honestly, one of our temptations is to not try to do the work. We would rather do nothing sometimes for or with other people for the sake of self-love. And I think that the Spirit of God led me this week to think deeply about the fact that immature believers struggle to identify the difference between self-love and being a lover of yourself. And then why am I bringing this up now? Because I know that it applies to our context. When Paul referring the lover of yourself part, when Paul was talking to Timothy, he talked about what the perilous times or troubled time or last times would look like. He said, in these terrible times, referring to the fact that there's something negative about this connotation, he brings up the fact that men and women would be lovers of themselves. I'm not saying, and no one is saying, that God does not want you to take care of yourself. By all means, it's important for you to learn what it looks like to steward your time, your energy, your efforts, your passions, your desires. Those are all God-given. Unless they're sinful, then they're your heart-given. They matter, but God's picture is communal. If it was just about you, he would have saved you and took you right on to heaven. But he left you here with a family of believers that he calls us to pour into, to invest, to spend time with, to believe with and for, to pray for, and to always point each other back to the cross. We all got an important part to play. And in this same passage in verse 9, Paul takes this very real countryside, like seed water planting, this real country analogy to the city by saying you're not just God's field, you're God's building. So it's a pretty universal message. We all live most of us live in the city around this area, and you see buildings going up left and right. What do you see when you see buildings going up left and right? You see a bunch of folks operating together as a team, building on a foundation to create something beautiful. So let's talk about the immature builder, maybe. Verse 10, Paul says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care of how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold and silver and precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it. And by day, capitalized there, he's referring to Judgment Day, where all of our deeds will be judged. Because it is revealed, it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If the work that anyone has done is burned up, then he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. Do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. See, it's real easy for us, 21st century Americans reading English, to read the word you here and miss what Paul is actually saying. A lot of times we are personalizing our you and making it singular. If I say you, you might think I'm talking about you. But the way this is written in the Greek, that you is actually not singular. It's plural. So Paul's talking about a community here. Now, for sure, in other portions of Scripture, he makes it very clear that I am singularly talking about you as being a temple of God. But in this particular portion, he's talking about us as the temple, house, community, church of God, the place where he rests, the place where he resides. And so keep that in mind. He's talking about us building a community. Now, if you're going to contribute to building on this foundation. Think about what Paul says. If you're going to build, he built like a skilled master builder. So Paul didn't leave back the good stuff. Like he didn't just come lazily into Corinth and just give anything and everything at this level. He came in like I've been doing this a while. I know the blueprint. I know the architect. I'm getting my directions from one whose knowledge is higher than myself. I am a skilled master builder, and I am laying this foundation, which is only Christ. But now he's expecting these believers in Corinth to come alongside and build on that foundation. So if you're going to contribute to building this house, this community, this house of God, build with the good stuff. Don't hold it back. I got to shout out my sister Rita, and she probably looking at me like I'm crazy, so I'm not going to look at her. I'm going to look over here. We have been asking folks for a few times now to provide meals for students. And everybody has knocked it out of the park. Thanks to the Bertlands, shout out to Carol. Everybody has knocked it out of the park. Rita, shout out to Rita, knocked it out of the park. But one thing that Rita said to me the other day, she said, I always go over top. And I was like, and God know that. God knows that. See, for Rita, in her heart, her desire to help build this community, build this house, pour into it, invest in students, she, motivated by love, motivated by action, feels the need to always go over top. The skilled master builder. And mind you, that food was off the chain. It was good. But don't hold the good stuff back. And you're like, well, what do I have to offer? You are the good stuff. God has put inside of you some skills. He's put inside of you some passions, some desires that we need. Don't hold it back. When we show up to church, y'all, we can't show up like SpongeBob believers. And no relation to the character. But Sponge. You know what sponges? You stick them in the water, and they just suck the water up, and you go take it off somewhere else. Sponge is only good for sucking up the water, going to take it and putting it somewhere else. We cannot just continue to show up to church to absorb without also realizing that God calls us to invest. Not just in this building, again, in the entire Christian community. We are called to not just absorb, be SpongeBobs. We're called to be builders, to invest. What would it look like for you to go to your home where you reside, get filled up by the Spirit of God, and come here and pour out encouragement to fellow brothers and sisters in God's kingdom? We got to invest. We got to move from being immature believers and being immature builders to mature believers and mature builders. In verse 10, Paul specifically says that each one of us should watch out for how he and she builds. And I thought for a second about that. And without trying to come across as rude, I think there's something really important about focusing on what you're building instead of being so focused on the other person and what they're doing. For example, when the whole story unfolded, when Jesus was trying to explain to folks what it looks like not to judge each other, he talked about you judging somebody with a speck in their eye. Meanwhile, you got an entire log in your eye. See, what I think Paul might be referring to is like how careful we need to be at focusing on how we are building, in a sense, a godly way to say mind your business, you know what I'm saying? But like, it's important for some of us to realize that maturing for us could simply be me focusing on what's going on in my own heart before I try to spill over into the rest of the team to build. But there's a flip side to that, because it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Some of us are on the other side, where we need to realize that maturity for us looks like recognizing that we are all each other's business. And what you do does matter. But be mature about it. Know what's going on in your own heart before you start trying to worry about what's happening in the rest of the building. Y'all, we got to build with genuine love, because fire is coming. We will be tested. The test of this building will be tested. We got to build with concentrated effort. It might require some sacrifice in there. Each one of us should be led to be gentle with one another when we are building God's community, when we are building relationships with one another. We need to be gentle, respectful, responsible. God might be calling us to listen to some loving correction that we might need. And being present in each other's life. Because verse 13 is clear, like, the fire is coming. Judgment day, how well we built, if we brought our best or we brought our worst, is coming. But before we get to that day, there will be ways in which we will see through trials and tribulations just what kind of building we're building here. For example, the quality of what we're building in these relationships, they might get exposed when people get disappointed. Emotional damage could occur. Quite possibly, panic could have happened. But y'all, if the Spirit of God is truly in us, like he said he is, and like he said he is truly amongst us, then we must remember to yield to him as he is maturing us. Because that's the only way that we will know how to maturely respond to when we are disappointed by one another. Only way we're going to learn how to respond when we are running into some emotional damage, or when all around us is mass panic, mass chaos. The only way we're going to know how to be mature is relying and yielding on that Spirit. The Spirit. The Spirit. Because what we need to be building as mature builders, not immature builders, is a good, fireproof, God-glorifying, I'm talking flood-proof, I'm talking wind-proof, classism-proof, election-proof, recession-proof, racism-proof. I'm talking God-glorifying work being done in these relationships and how we're building his community that he resides in. We got to make sure we're doing that. Ephesians 3:20, as I get ready to wrap, says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them." It's work to be done. We got to build this house. And if our faith isn't inspiring us to do good work, then maybe we're not grasping the entirety of the gospel. If we're not doing good work in community, society, in our hearts, in our church, in our family, in our small groups, right here, then maybe we're not grasping the gospel in its entirety. Let's clear it up. The creator of all things, God, made us and the whole of creation good and beautiful. But because of the sin and corruption that man introduced into the world, he has had to carry out a divine plan to restore all things back to new. See, this plan would include him partnering with humanity. This plan would include him partnering with humanity to bring about the forgiveness of sins for humanity. And then he then stepped into humanity, dying on the cross a real human death, raised back to life in a real human body, and then offers salvation through faith to us, then commissions us to now be his witnesses, examples, hands, and feet, as he works out this plan for total restoration for the whole of creation. It's that deep. We got to build maturely on that. If you believe this, then you are his temple. You are his home. You are his community, church, or workmanship, saved unto good works. Not by good works, but unto them. Saved unto mature works. And if you haven't believed this before, but perhaps maybe today you might find yourself intrigued by it, then the invitation from God Almighty is that you come, taste and see that the Lord is good. I'd love to talk to you more about that afterwards. Let's pray.